Professor David Friedman.
There are basically two ways of arguing for libertarianism, or for that matter, for any other political position. One of them is to make a moral argument, to say what we want is right, what they want is wrong. And the alternative is to argue a consequentialist case, to argue that what we want will produce more of what people want than the alternative. And I am going to argue in favor of the latter approach and give at least one example of it. The problem with the moral argument, there are really two problems. The first is that although moral philosophy is a very old project, it has never yet succeeded in providing any arguments that will convince anybody. That it is good for preaching to the converted, and if you want to get a mob going for a revolution, it probably makes sense, if they already agree with you, to explain to them why they're the good guys and the other side is the bad guys. But it is not very useful for persuading people who don't agree with you. Furthermore, not only do we have no good way of showing that our moral beliefs are right, if you think about our moral beliefs carefully, they become fuzzier and fuzzier the more they look at them. So that libertarians like to make simple statements such as that you should I just switch to this one? Such as that you should never violate anybody's property rights, but we don't really believe it. My favorite example of this is due to the late Bill Bradford, who was the editor of Liberty magazine and was a great loss to the movement. And his example is that you're on the balcony of your apartment on the 10th floor of a building. You somehow manage to fall off. You luckily catch hold of the flagpole of the 9th floor apartment's balcony, and you're going hand over hand in to get onto that balcony when the owner of the apartment comes out and tells you that you do not have his permission to use his flagpole. Do you let go? Nobody does. So we don't really believe the sort of strong, bright line views that we like to state our principles in. And the more you try to soften those to make them actually fit what we believe, the more complicated they are. So although moral philosophy is doubtless an entertaining activity, I don't regard it as the right intellectual approach for convincing people of things. What about economic arguments? We can offer real-world evidence, at least for the extreme cases, for the economic arguments. We have, after all, a series of neat paired cases: East Germany and West Germany, South Korea and North Korea, Maoist China and Taiwan, Maoist China and post-Maoist China. In all of those cases, the much less free system also produced much worse results. There is, however, a logical problem, and that is that the claim that consequences are good is itself a moral claim. So how do we know what is or is not good? And the answer is we don't have to solve that problem. And the reason we don't have to solve that problem is that people already have moral beliefs, and although they aren't all identical, they have a high correlation. There are very few people out in the world who believe that it is good for people to be miserable and hungry and ignorant and things like that. So therefore, as long as we can plausibly argue that libertarianism produces not only better results, but much better results than the alternative, most people would support it. And therefore, if we can win the consequentialist argument, I think that does the job. That would not work if either different people had very different views or if liberty was only a little bit better. If the result of having a libertarian society was that it was a little more prosperous and a little less egalitarian, then somebody who was in favor of equality might prefer something else. But if you look at the actual socialist systems, they were neither prosperous nor egalitarian. They were, in fact, on the whole, rather less egalitarian than libertarian systems are. It's hard to make the argument for small changes, but at least for the large changes, it's pretty clear. So I am now going to make a sketch of the economic argument for why liberty is better. And the economic argument starts with the coordination problem, which many of you have doubtless thought about, that to do anything in a large society, even as simple as making a pencil, ultimately involves the cooperation of a very large number of people, probably millions of people. Pencil is a standard libertarian example for some reason. And if you think about it, you need wood. That means you need chainsaws to cut down trees. That means you need steel and gasoline and each of those things, you need a whole bunch of things. So in order to have a workable system, I'm going to move up to here so I can read that screen which tells me what's happening next. In order to have a workable system, you have got to somehow coordinate a very large number of people. And there are basically two solutions to the coordination problem, very broadly defined. The obvious one is centralized control. The obvious one is you have somebody who figures out what everybody should do and tells them to do it. And that works for small groups, if you think about a small firm, say. But it scales very badly, because as the number of layers goes up, the distance between the guy at the top who's making the decisions and the people at the bottom who are implementing them gets larger. It's harder for him to know what they ought to do or what they're doing. It is less likely that his interests are the same as their interests, and therefore you may have the person at the top sacrificing the workers for what he wants. And of course, the coordination problem gets harder. So the obvious one works on a small scale, but it doesn't work for coordinating a society. And we've got some evidence on that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the obvious example. The decentralized one does scale. And the decentralized solution basically consists of breaking your problem into pieces such that each of them is controlled by a person who is a reasonably well-chosen person to control it. So, for example, the decision of what job I will work in is made by me, and I am indeed the person who both controls my body, which makes it easier for me to control me than for you to control me, and also the person who knows the most about what things I can do and like. And then the hard part is to arrange things in such a way that each actor bears the cost of his actions and receives the benefit. Because if you can do that, then that means that if it's in his interest, it's in our interest. And that is the ideal decentralized system. And if you think about it for a few minutes, it's clearly impossible. Because how can you have a system where somehow, when I take an action that affects lots of people, I get the benefit and I bear the cost? But in fact, a market system comes surprisingly close to doing it. And if you think about the logic of how the market system works, if I need inputs for producing something, I've got to buy them. What does that mean? It means I've got to compensate my workers with enough so that they'd rather work for me than anything else. So I'm transferring the cost of their labor from them to me. I've got to pay the people who provide my inputs other than labor enough so that either they're willing to make them for me or they're willing to give up what they were going to do with those inputs. So again, the price is transferring to me the cost that's being imposed by what I'm doing. And the same thing is true about the benefit. Because I produce something, I can sell it, and I can sell it for roughly the value to the buyer. So that means that I'm getting both the costs and the benefits transferred to me, and therefore my net benefit is, roughly speaking, our net benefit. That's the basic logic of the market as a decentralized system, and it takes a lot more than a 2-minute talk to explain all of it, but I think the sketch is at least useful. There is, however, a problem, and the problem is what's generally referred to as market failure. That's a misleading term because market failure is not limited to markets. My standard example is why armies run away. But market failure does exist on markets. And basically, market failure is a situation where the individual actor either doesn't have to pay some of the costs he imposes or cannot collect the benefit he produces, with the result that his interest is no longer the same as our interest, and that he is therefore led to making decisions which are not either decisions that make us worse off or failing to make decisions that would make us better off. And that's the standard economist's argument for government intervention. There are other arguments that people make about equality and things like that, but the basic reason why most economists are not anarchists or even libertarians, although more of them are, I think economists relative to other intellectuals are more likely to be sympathetic to the market. Because the strongest argument against our position is the difficulty of understanding how it's possible to have decentralized coordination. And if you don't understand that, you're not an economist. So even the socialist economists, the Abba Lerner, who was a very good socialist economist, and what he was trying to do was to figure out a way in which a socialist society could imitate the decentralized structure of a capitalist society and thus get the benefits. So even decent economists who are on the wrong side are, in a sense, on the right side. There is a problem, however, with the solution of government regulation to solve market failure. And the problem with that, there are really a couple of problems. The first is it requires the regulator to have information that the regulator usually doesn't have. He has to know the costs and benefits so that he knows what he should be trying to make the market do. And second, and probably more serious, it requires him to have the right incentive. Why would it be in the interest of the government to do that? And the economic argument for government regulation implicitly is assuming a government that both has complete knowledge and disinterested benevolence. And that's the wrong way conceptually to think of the government. It's not that people in government are any worse than anybody else or any better. But the right way to think of government is as a political market, not as a person. There isn't, in that sense, government doesn't exist. There is no rational actor up there deciding what to do. There is the outcome of a different market under different rules. And if you consider the political market as a different decentralized system, you can then see that it has the same problem only in spades. That the basic issue of does the actor bear the net cost of his action is one which is sometimes a problem in the private market. You've got things like air pollution. You've got things like public goods, goods where the producer can't control who gets it and therefore can't get properly rewarded for it. But unlike the private market, the normal situation is that the producer bears costs and gets benefits, but there are a bunch of exceptions. Therefore, the private market will not always do the right thing. But you need a candidate to beat a candidate. And the alternative to the private market is a public market where, for example, what's supposed to make government behave itself is voting. But it is in nobody's interest to be a rational voter, because you as an individual voter know that your vote has one chance in a million or so of affecting an outcome. It makes much more sense to decide what to vote for on the basis of what position will make you popular with your friends. If you're a guy, what position will make the girls want to date you? Maybe what position will make your employer think you're a good person and promote you. Those are all cases where you get a real effect from the voting, and the other does not. So therefore, it's not surprising that voters very rarely have the information they would have to have in order to do a good job of controlling it. And that's true all the way through the system. If you think about all of the actors, judges don't bear the cost of their mistakes. So in general, there is no reason to expect that the political actors' action will be the action that's in our interest. That market failure, as I like to put it, is the exception on the private market and it's the rule on the political market. And if you contrast the alternatives, under liberty, each individual deciding you have solutions to the information problem, not perfect solutions, but since the individual making the decision is the one who has the most information about that piece of the problem, and I am the one person who can be trusted to act in my interest. Maybe my wife, but maybe even my kids, I'm not sure. So liberty, the decentralized solution, solves the coordination problem imperfectly, but better than the alternative. And one of my father's sayings was that it is a capital mistake to make the best the enemy of the good. So it's imperfect, but still better than alternatives. This is only a sketch. For a more complete version of this argument, you need about 2 semesters of price theory, but I happen to have written a book which is intended as a substitute for 2 semesters of price theory and is more fun than the price theory course. That's Hidden Order. Other places you can get information are my website, daviddfriedman.com, which has the full text of multiple books and articles, links to my Substack posts, which come out every 3 days. One is coming out today. On a wide range of subjects. Can you click on the link to my webpage? There you are. So that will show you, and if the Substack post sorted, if you can click on that, which maybe you can't, shows, anyway. Now, not the Substack itself, the post sorted, but that's all right. Anyway, I've made a lot of posts, and they cover a lot of things. So I should end now so that somebody gets to ask a question because we're running out of time. Thank you.
Thank you for your insightful conversation.
Do we get a question?
Do you have a question?
I tried to cut it.
We have a time for a question. Do we
Yes.
have a space for a question? Okay, let's go. Where is the best question? Okay, here. I can give you my microphone.
Thank you, David Friedman. So my question is, what you're saying is not enough. What if we convince people that the way of liberty is the most efficient one, but they have some sort of other goals? Let's say we convince them that the free market economy is the most efficient way of allocating resources, but they make an argument in a way, for example, national security. Of course, the free market is the most efficient way, but for the reasons of national security, we have to be self-sufficient. How would you address that?
I could imagine a world where that was true, but I don't think it is very likely in the world that exists, because for a country, maybe the US could do it, but for most countries at least, being self-sufficient means being dirt poor, because in fact, it is very hard to grow bananas in Sweden. So I think you have to recognize that there are good arguments on the other side. There are arguments for some existence of government. I'm an anarchist, but a somewhat pessimistic anarchist. I don't think that an anarchist society would function, would survive under all possible environments. So you have to recognize that there are arguments, but the counter-argument is continually, yes, there is some pattern of restrictions on trade that would be in the interest of the country, but why would you expect the politicians to produce it when it's much more profitable to restrict trade in order to prevent competition from firms that you own stock in?